It started on a late September evening when I decided to take a short solo trip to the mountains of western North Carolina. I'd found a cabin online, remote, rustic, advertised as off the grid, and perfect for solitude. I was burned out from work and needed time alone, away from cities, phones, and people. The photos showed a small two-story cabin perched on the edge of a ridge, surrounded by dense forest. There was a narrow path leading down to a creek, and smoke curling from the chimney in the pictures made it look inviting. The drive was long and winding, the kind of road that makes every curve feel like it could drop you off a cliff. By the time I turned onto the last dirt path, night had fallen. The moon was just a thin sliver, barely lighting the forest. When I reached the cabin, it was even more isolated than I expected. No lights anywhere, just the silhouette of the cabin against the dark tree line. My car's headlights illuminated a porch that sagged on one side and steps that creaked under my weight. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and old pine. There was a small kitchen, a wood stove, and a living room with threadbare furniture. A narrow staircase led upstairs to two bedrooms. There was a stack of firewood by the door and a jar of matches sitting on the counter. No phone signal, of course, but I thought it would be fine. After all, that was the point. I lit a fire and made a simple dinner, trying to shake off the unease that had been creeping in since the drive. The first night was quiet, except for the wind in the trees and the occasional snap of a branch outside. Around midnight, though, I heard it, a scratching at the front door. Sharp, deliberate, like nails dragged across wood. My first thought was an animal, but the rhythm was too regular, too controlled. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside. Nothing. No movement, no footprints in the dirt, nothing except the way the trees loomed in the moonlight. I shook my head, convinced myself I was just tired, and went back inside. But when I turned to close the door, I noticed deep scratches on the wood, scratches that hadn't been there before. The next day, I explored the area around the cabin. The forest was dense, thick with moss and fallen leaves. I found a small path leading down to the creek. The water was clear and cold, and I followed it for a while before the path ended abruptly at a moss-covered stone wall. Strange. It looked like part of an old structure, maybe ruins of something that had been there decades ago. I snapped some pictures and went back to the cabin, feeling a growing unease. That evening, as the sun set, the wind picked up. The trees seemed to close in around the cabin. I was cooking dinner when I heard it, a whisper, soft and sibilant, coming from somewhere outside. I froze, straining to hear. Then it came again, a single word, inside. My heart raced. I was alone. There was no one there. I spent the night in the living room, fire blazing, flashlight in hand. Every sound, the creak of the stairs, the wind rattling the windows, the shifting of the walls, made me jump. Around 2 a.m., I heard footsteps upstairs. Slow, deliberate. Not like someone pacing, more like someone walking methodically from one room to the other. I called out, my voice shaking, but no one answered. The steps stopped outside my bedroom door. I shined the flashlight toward the stairs. Nothing. The following morning, I discovered something that chilled me to the bone. On the kitchen counter, written in what looked like mud or soot, were words, "Don't leave." My first thought was that it was a prank, but the nearest road was miles away, and there were no other cabins in sight. No one could have done this. Over the next few days, things escalated. Doors I had locked were found wide open. The firewood I stacked neatly would be scattered across the floor. Sometimes I would glance at a window and see a figure standing just outside, shadowed by the trees, watching me. It never moved, never came closer, just stared. I tried leaving, but every path I took seemed to circle back to the cabin. The forest was endless, and the cabin always stood at the center. One night, I woke up to a soft humming. I couldn't place the tune, but it was haunting, almost childlike. It came from the bedroom upstairs. I froze. Slowly I climbed the stairs, gripping the flashlight like a weapon. The humming stopped the moment I reached the top. I looked into the bedrooms, empty. But then I noticed the closet in the corner. The door was slightly ajar, and a cold draft seeped from it. I opened it. Nothing. But I felt it, like someone had been breathing on the back of my neck. Sleep became impossible. I stayed awake for days, fire burning, flashlight never leaving my side. The whispers grew louder, sometimes multiple voices, chanting, calling my name. Stay. Forever. The shadows moved in ways that didn't make sense, stretching along the walls, sometimes appearing in places where there was no light. I started writing notes to myself, trying to document everything. The more I wrote, the more I realized the cabin wasn't just a place. It was alive, watching, learning. On the fourth night, I woke to a noise downstairs, a dragging sound like furniture being pulled across the floor. I shined the flashlight into the living room. Nothing. Then I saw it. Scratches along the walls, deeper than before, forming shapes that made no sense, yet somehow felt like a message. I pressed my ear to the wall. Whispering. Not human, not animal, just low, guttural murmurs. By the fifth night, I had accepted that leaving wasn't an option. The forest had claimed me, or the cabin had. I wasn't sure which. I stayed in the corner of the living room, fire roaring, flashlight on, listening to the whispers and footsteps. Sometimes I would see the figure at the window, or just a shape in the corner of the room. The air felt heavy, almost solid, and the temperature dropped sharply whenever I moved closer to the door. I don't remember how many nights passed. Time lost meaning. I would wake up to find more messages, more scratches, the feeling of being watched constantly. Once I swore I saw my own reflection in the stove's metal surface, but it wasn't me. It was pale, hollow-eyed, smiling at me. I screamed, and the reflection vanished. Eventually, I stopped trying to fight it. I spoke to the cabin, whispered back, trying to reason with it. The whispers changed then, responding to me, taunting me, laughing. The figure at the window began to move closer each night until, one evening, it was standing just outside the door, silhouette black against the firelight. It didn't knock, didn't speak, just waited. I tried to leave again, desperate, but the forest twisted. Every path I took returned me to the cabin, no matter which way I turned. It was like being caught in a loop, the trees closing in, the wind mocking me. I realized then that the cabin didn't want me to leave. It wanted me to stay, forever, part of the walls, the wood, the shadows. Now, years later, I tell this story because I can, but I am not the same. I still feel it watching me, in my dreams, in the corners of my eyes. Sometimes I wake up to the sound of scratching on my bedroom walls or a whisper in the darkness. I know that the cabin is out there, somewhere, waiting for the next person to wander too deep into the forest to find its door and never leave. Some places are not meant for humans. Some places are alive and patient and hungry. And some, like that cabin, never forget the ones who enter. Story the end. It had been a long drive, a stretch of highway that had narrowed into cracked two-lane roads lined with pine and oak. The kind of roads where the shadows of trees spilled across the asphalt in the late afternoon sun, making it feel darker than it should. Casey had been looking forward to this weekend for months, a getaway from the city, from the noise, the unending demands of her job, and the constant hum of life that left her brain aching. She had found the cabin online, tucked away in the northern woods of Vermont, advertised as secluded, peaceful, and utterly private. The photos were rustic but charming. Log walls darkened by age, a stone fireplace, a small deck that overlooked a pond. The owner assured her it was the perfect place to disconnect. That was exactly what Casey needed. The first hint of unease came not from the woods themselves, but from the turnoff onto the dirt road leading to the cabin. The GPS kept recalculating, refusing to recognize the path as a through street. Casey muttered under her breath as the tires bounced over the uneven surface. The trees were closer here, tighter, their branches clawing at the edges of the road, scratching the car with dry whispers. A sense of isolation settled over her. She told herself it was silly. Plenty of people lived in the area, and she had directions in case she needed to call for help. Still, the further she drove, the more the shadows seemed to shift, as if the forest itself were rearranging to block her progress. Finally, the cabin appeared. It was smaller than she expected, almost swallowed by the surrounding trees. The log walls were dark with moisture, the roof steep and mossy, and the porch sagged under its own age. She parked and took a deep breath. The air smelled of damp earth and pine resin, sharp and clean. She unlocked the door and stepped inside. The cabin smelled faintly of wood smoke and dust. The furniture was sparse, a small couch, a wooden table with 2 chairs, a single bed pushed into the corner, and an old cast-iron stove that had clearly not been used in years. Casey ran her hand over the table and shivered. Something about the place felt wrong, But it wasn't until she explored the rest of the cabin that the first real unease set in. The bedroom had a window that faced the woods directly. Casey could see the dark trunks of trees pressed together like spectators outside. The bed had fresh sheets, but they smelled faintly musty, as if they had been washed with something other than detergent. In the corner, a small chest sat untouched. She tried the drawers, but they were locked. There was a note tucked under the pillow. "Don't go into the woods after dark." She laughed nervously. "Yeah, right," she whispered to herself. "It's just a cabin." Casey spent the rest of the afternoon unpacking, wandering through the cabin, lighting the fireplace, and making herself some instant noodles. The sky darkened quickly, a heavy gray that pressed through the windows and swallowed the last bits of daylight. By the time she finished eating, the woods outside were almost black, and a low wind whispered through the branches. That night, sleep came fitfully. Every crack of wood settling, every rustle of leaves sounded unnaturally loud. Around 2 a.m., Casey woke to a soft tapping at the window. At first, she thought it was branches, but when she strained her eyes, she saw a figure standing just beyond the glass. Tall, thin, completely still. She froze, heart hammering, and blinked. When she opened her eyes again, it was gone. The next day, she tried to convince herself it had been her imagination. She went for a walk, staying on the path that led from the cabin to the nearest stream. Birds scattered at her approach, and the wind carried strange groans through the trees. Something in the forest seemed alive, and it wasn't animals. It was watching her. By late afternoon, she returned to the cabin, feeling a deep, inexplicable exhaustion. The feeling of being observed never left her. That evening, she found scratches along the porch railing, fresh, deep lines that hadn't been there before. Panic clawed at her chest, but she told herself it was likely an animal, maybe a raccoon or a bear. She tried to keep busy, lighting the fire again, reading a book, but the sense of dread pressed on her like water against a door. As darkness fell again, she noticed something else. Small stones arranged in a rough circle at the edge of the trees, barely visible in the moonlight. She had not placed them there. Something about their symmetry was deliberate, purposeful, and it made her stomach turn. She tried to push it out of her mind, telling herself she had been under too much stress. By the third night, the isolation began to gnaw at her. Every sound felt amplified. The creek murmuring through the woods, the wind scratching the roof, the occasional pop from the old stove. Around midnight, she heard it. A low, deliberate knock on the cabin door. Not the wind, not a branch. Someone or something was outside. Casey held her breath, every instinct screaming to run, but curiosity kept her rooted in place. She peered through the window and saw nothing. Then the knock came again, harder this time, followed by a slow, dragging sound across the porch. Casey's fingers fumbled over her phone, but there was no signal. She backed away from the door, heart hammering, and tried to convince herself it was a branch or an animal, but the dragging sound was deliberate, methodical. A sudden banging at the window made her scream and fall back. She couldn't see who or what was there, only that the glass rattled violently, the shadows shifting outside. Then silence. Morning came, gray and heavy. Casey's nerves were raw, but daylight offered a fragile sense of safety. She packed her bag, deciding to leave immediately, but as she reached for the door handle, she noticed it, deep gouges carved into the wood. They spelled something, letters at first glance, jagged and uneven. She couldn't read it clearly, but it made her stomach twist. Someone had been inside while she slept, or had they been outside, just waiting? Casey left the cabin quickly, retracing her path along the narrow dirt road. The forest seemed different in daylight, less threatening, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the trees were still watching, their trunks aligned in impossible formations, as if guarding some secret. Back in her car, she tried to relax, telling herself she would never return. But as she drove, she noticed movement in the rearview mirror. A figure, barely discernible, walking through the trees, tall, thin, with an unnatural stillness. It mirrored the one she had seen the first night. She blinked, and it was gone. But her unease didn't fade. Over the next weeks, Casey tried to put the experience behind her. She told friends it was just nerves and overactive imagination. But the nightmares didn't stop. Every night, she dreamt of the cabin, the woods, the tall figure standing at the edge of the trees. Sometimes she would wake up to find small scratches on her arms or legs, shallow but deliberate. She stopped going outside at night, stopped answering knocks on the door. The feeling of being watched followed her, even in her apartment in the city. One night, she received a package at her door. No return address. Inside was a small stone, perfectly round, with a jagged line etched across its surface. Casey froze, her heart pounding, recognizing it immediately. The stones from the circle at the edge of the cabin's woods. She wanted to scream, to throw it away, but she couldn't. A note inside read simply, "You left too soon." The next day, she found more stones arranged in patterns in her apartment, on the windowsill, in the bathroom, even on her bed. Panic set in fully now. She called the authorities, but they found nothing suspicious. No footprints, no signs of forced entry, nothing that could explain the stones appearing with no one else around. Casey moved cities, changed her number, changed her routines, but it didn't help. Every night, the same dreams returned. The cabin, the circle of stones, the figure standing silently among the trees. She began to hear faint knocking on her apartment door at night, soft but deliberate, like a rhythm she could not ignore. Over time, she realized that she was being followed, not just by the figure, but by the memory of the cabin itself. No matter where she went, she could see it in her mind's eye. The sagging porch, the dark woods, the stones forming circles at the edge of the trees. And sometimes, late at night, she would catch sight of a shadow in the corner of her apartment, elongated and still, and she would know without question that the woods had followed her. Years passed. Casey stopped sleeping properly, her life consumed by an ever-present fear. She couldn't talk about it without sounding insane, and she couldn't ignore it without risking her sanity entirely. Every decision she made, every city she moved to, every attempt at normalcy was haunted by the cabin and the forest and the figure that waited silently among the trees. Eventually, she accepted that it would never end. The cabin wasn't just a place, it was a presence, a shadow that extended far beyond its walls, and the woods, the endless, oppressive woods, were patient. They had waited for her once, and they would wait again, for however long it took. Sometimes, when she closed her eyes, she could hear the tapping at the window, the dragging across the porch, the low, deliberate knocks, and she knew deep down that no matter where she ran, no matter how far, the cabin would find her again. Story the end. The first time I heard about the cabin, it was through a throwaway comment my coworker made during a lunch break. "Ever been up by Clearview Woods?" he asked, half joking. "There's this old cabin, totally cut off. Folks say people who go there don't come back the same." I laughed, thinking he was just trying to freak me out. I didn't really think much of it at the time, but as days turned into weeks, I couldn't shake the image of a lone cabin deep in the woods, hidden from any road, any cell signal, any kind of civilization. I had always been drawn to isolated places, the quiet that lets you hear yourself think, and maybe something about that cabin felt like it was calling me. I didn't tell anyone I was going. Not my friends, not my family. I didn't want anyone to try to talk me out of it. It was late October, the kind of cold that makes the air sharp, brittle, and clean. I packed light, a backpack with a sleeping bag, a flashlight, a couple of cans of beans, a small first aid kit, and some water. The drive took hours through narrow, winding roads flanked by trees that had already lost most of their leaves. The sun was beginning its slow descent when I finally saw it, half hidden by the shadow of tall pines, a structure that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. The cabin was small, maybe 2 rooms at most. The wood had aged into a deep gray, and the windows were clouded with dirt, but the front door seemed intact. I pushed it open slowly. It creaked but didn't resist. Inside, the air was heavy with dust and the smell of decay, but it wasn't what I expected. There was an eerie sort of order, old furniture in its place, a thin layer of dust over it, but nothing overturned, nothing broken. I unpacked quickly, tried to make the place livable for the night. I lit a small propane stove I had brought along, ate cold beans, and watched the shadows stretch long and thin across the walls. That night, I barely slept. I kept hearing sounds outside, branches snapping, leaves rustling. I chalked it up to deer, or maybe the wind. But at some point, I swore I heard footsteps, slow, deliberate, pacing just beyond the walls. I gripped my flashlight, straining to see, but nothing was there. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I dozed off. When I woke, the first thing I noticed was that my backpack had been moved. I remembered placing it in the corner near the door, but now it was closer to the middle of the room. I tried to tell myself I must have done it in my half sleep, that I was imagining things. I unpacked the small stove and tried to make some coffee, but the coffee grounds were scattered on the floor. I hadn't done that. I spent the next day exploring the surrounding woods. I wanted to convince myself that I was alone, that no one had been here, that nothing had touched my things. The deeper I went into the forest, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind, just this heavy, unnatural silence. I found old remnants of a fire pit, some rusted cans, and a shallow hole that looked recently disturbed. My stomach churned. That night was worse. I heard scratching at the walls, at the windows, and then the door. My first instinct was to lock it, but the lock was old and fragile, like it would crumble if I even touched it. I held the flashlight like a weapon and tried to stay awake, but somewhere around 3 in the morning, exhaustion caught me. I must have fallen asleep sitting in the corner because I woke to the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, right next to my ear. I spun around. Nothing. Just the shadows stretching across the walls. My flashlight flickered. I shook it, and it came back on. The room was empty. I decided then and there to leave first thing in the morning. But morning never came, or at least it didn't feel like it. When I opened my eyes, it was dark. The kind of dark that doesn't belong to night, the kind that feels suffocating. I got up and stumbled outside, only to realize the woods had shifted. The trees were taller, closer together, and the cabin didn't look the same. It was larger, more menacing, with windows that weren't there before, and I could swear I saw figures moving inside. I ran, but the forest seemed endless. Every path I took twisted back on itself. Every clearing led me right back to the cabin, and the sounds followed me. Footsteps, whispers, laughter, low groaning. I felt like I was being watched, stalked, hunted. I tried calling out, but my voice sounded muffled, swallowed by the trees. My phone was dead, as though the forest had swallowed the signal entirely. Days, or maybe hours, I couldn't tell, blurred together. I started noticing things I hadn't before. Strange carvings on the trees, symbols etched into the bark, tiny figures like dolls hanging from branches, faces in the shadows vanishing when I looked directly at them. The air had a thick metallic taste, and my skin felt like it was crawling. I realized that the cabin wasn't just a building. It was a trap, a lure. Something about it changed the world around it, warped it to keep you there. One night I dared to peek inside again. The furniture had shifted. There were footprints in the dust that weren't mine, leading from the corner where I had slept to the window. I could hear someone, or something, whispering my name. At first it was faint, but then it grew louder, more insistent. "Come back. Stay with us." I ran again, but the forest had a way of bending, guiding me back to the cabin every time. I started leaving marks on the trees, hoping to find a way out, but each time I retraced my steps, the marks were gone or moved. Hunger and thirst gnawed at me, and I realized that I wasn't even sure how long I had been there. The forest had a rhythm, a pulse, and it was syncing with mine, drawing me deeper into a kind of madness. At some point, I stopped trying to escape. I just stayed in the shadows near the cabin, watching. The figures inside were not human. They moved in jerky, unnatural ways, their eyes glinting in the dark. Sometimes I saw shadows peel off from the walls, stretching toward me like smoke. They never spoke, but I understood them. They wanted me to stay. They wanted me to belong. I tried to resist. I shouted, I ran, I hid, but each time the forest responded. Branches reached for me, the ground swallowed me, the wind whispered secrets I didn't want to hear. I realized that the cabin had always been here, waiting. It wasn't abandoned, it was alive. And now it had me. I don't remember how long I've been here. The days are all the same, in fact, the nights endless. Sometimes I catch glimpses of other people, like me, lost in the woods, wandering, drawn to the cabin. They never speak, and when I try to call to them, they vanish. I've stopped trying to leave. The cabin has made that clear. I've learned to listen to the whispers, to move with the shadows. They tell me things, secrets of the forest, of the cabin, of the things that live beyond the trees. Sometimes I think I can hear my own voice, calling back to me from the walls, telling me to stay. And I do. I don't think anyone will ever find this place. The forest hides it, reshapes it, protects it. The road I came in on is gone, and if I tried to retrace my steps, I'd end up back here in front of the cabin, staring at the same peeling wood, the same clouded windows, the same door that creaks open just enough for me to step inside. I've stopped thinking about escape. It's futile. The forest is patient, and so is the cabin. I exist now only to observe, to remember who I was, to learn the rhythms of this place. The figures inside the cabin have started to acknowledge me, no longer hiding, no longer whispering. They move alongside me in the shadows, always just beyond sight, always present. Sometimes I wonder if this is what people mean when they say someone doesn't come back the same. I am here, I am alive, but I am not the person who drove up to that cabin all those weeks ago. The woods have a memory, and they've rewritten mine. If anyone ever comes here, I hope they understand what they're getting into. There is no road out, no help from the outside, no dawn that brings relief. Only the trees, the shadows, the whispers, and the cabin that waits, patient and eternal, for the next person who thinks they're brave enough to enter. I write this now because I feel it slipping from me, the last remnants of the life I had before. The cabin is patient, but even it wants acknowledgement, a record of those who've walked through its doors and become part of it. If you are reading this, know that you are already too late for me, but you still might have a choice. Turn back. Walk away. Don't listen to the whispers. Don't look at the windows. The forest will try to draw you in, and if it succeeds, you will never leave. I hear footsteps now, clothes moving along the walls. My flashlight flickers. The shadows are long, curling toward me. The cabin waits. I wait, and I know in the deepest part of myself that this is where I will remain, forever. Story, the end. It was late October when I decided to take a break from everything, work, people, noise, and rent a cabin deep in the woods of northern Vermont. I needed quiet, isolation, the kind that made you feel like the world had forgotten you existed. The listing had promised seclusion and rustic charm, and the photos showed a small wooden cabin surrounded by towering pines, a creek snaking through the property, and trails that vanished into the forest. I thought it would be perfect. The drive up from Burlington was long. My phone lost signal halfway through, which I welcomed, and the trees became denser as I followed the narrow, winding road. I passed a few houses, each one set far apart, their driveways overgrown. The autumn light was fading quickly, and soon a mist had settled over the road, clinging to the pine needles and making everything look like a watercolor painting. Eventually, I turned down a barely visible dirt path and saw the cabin. It was exactly like the pictures, but somehow smaller in person. The wood was weathered gray, the windows looked dusty, and the porch sagged slightly in the middle. Inside, the cabin smelled of old wood, damp earth, and a faint hint of smoke from someone having lit a fire a long time ago. There was a single room with a small kitchenette, a wood stove, and a dining table. To the side, a narrow hallway led to a bedroom and a bathroom. There were no modern conveniences, no Wi-Fi, no cable, but the power worked, and there was a stack of firewood in the corner. Perfect for a weekend of solitude. The first night was quiet, almost eerily so. The wind rustled through the trees, and the creek babbled softly nearby. I made a fire, cooked some pasta, and settled into the cabin's old armchair with a book. At first, the silence was comforting, but as the night deepened, it started to feel different. It wasn't the peaceful silence I had imagined. It was hollow, heavy, like the air itself was watching. Around midnight, I thought I heard footsteps outside, crunching into the fallen leaves. My first instinct was to convince myself it was an animal, deer, maybe a fox, but the sounds were deliberate, paced like someone walking slowly along the porch. I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside, but the night was empty. No footprints, no movement in the trees, nothing but the swaying of branches. I went back inside, my pulse racing, telling myself I was just tired and jumpy. The next day, I explored the property. The creek was beautiful, and I followed it upstream until I found a small waterfall hidden behind a cluster of evergreens. There were signs of wildlife, deer tracks, broken branches, but nothing that suggested humans had been there recently. The cabin felt isolated in a way that was almost too complete. Even when I called the rental office from my car on the way into town, the line was static, as if the woods swallowed the sound. That evening, I decided to stay in, light another fire, and try to relax. As the sky darkened, the wind picked up, rattling the windows. I heard it again, the slow, deliberate footsteps. This time, they circled the cabin, moving around the back, then stopping near the bedroom window. My stomach turned cold. I told myself to be rational. Maybe it was the wind, maybe branches scraping, maybe my imagination. But when I heard a low thump, like something heavy landing against the wall of the cabin, I froze. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly approached the bedroom. The window curtains moved slightly, though there was no breeze inside. I shined the light outside and saw nothing. But then I noticed something strange. The ground beneath the window had an indentation, like something had been pressed there, as if someone had leaned against it. My heart was hammering. I debated leaving, but I had no car in working order. I'd rented the cabin without checking if cell service actually existed, and now I realized why. I felt trapped. I spent the night in the armchair, clutching the flashlight. Every creak of the cabin floor, every rustle outside made me jump. Around 3 a.m., I heard a voice. Just one word, whispered so softly I thought I imagined it. Go. I froze. My breath came out in shaky clouds. The voice came again, this time clearer. Go now. I don't know what compelled me, but I stayed. The sun came up eventually, and I convinced myself it had been a dream. But when I went outside, I noticed something disturbing. Around the cabin, there were footprints. Not animal prints, but human, barefoot, dragging slightly, circling the cabin in the same pattern I had heard at night. My stomach dropped. There was no one around, and the prints didn't continue into the woods. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. Over the next few days, the incidents became more frequent. Doors I had locked would be slightly ajar when I returned. The firewood stack I had organized neatly one morning would be scattered by evening. At night, the footsteps grew louder, closer, sometimes stopping right outside my door. Sometimes I thought I saw movement through the corner of my eye, a shadow crossing the wall, disappearing when I turned to look. One night I woke up to the sound of someone breathing heavily in the room. The fire had died down, and the cabin was dark except for the moonlight filtering through the window. My heart leapt into my throat. I fumbled for the flashlight, and when I shone it toward the sound, the beam landed on the bedroom door. The door was slightly cracked, and I could see a dark silhouette standing there. It didn't move, didn't speak, just stood watching. I screamed, grabbed the nearest thing, a cast iron skillet, and swung at it. Nothing. When I looked again, the silhouette was gone. By the fourth night, I stopped trying to rationalize. The cabin had a presence. I could feel it in the air, in the floorboards, in the way the shadows stretched too long. I tried leaving, but every path out of the woods seemed to twist back toward the cabin. It was as if the forest had reshaped itself, trapping me inside. I started leaving notes for myself, writing down everything I experienced, hoping to make sense of it. One evening, while exploring the woods behind the cabin, I found an old, abandoned campsite. There was a rusted metal barrel, tattered tent fabric, and a circle of stones that looked like a fire pit. But what caught my attention was the carvings on the trees around it, symbols I didn't recognize, deep gouges that looked like they had been made with a knife. Something about the shapes felt aggressive, as if they were warnings. I couldn't read them, but I knew I wasn't supposed to be there. Returning to the cabin, I found more signs that someone or something had been inside. The kitchen drawers were open, utensils scattered, a single muddy footprint leading from the door to the stove. I tried to convince myself it could be a bear or another animal, but the footprints were distinctly human. Small, but human. And they didn't belong to me. Sleep became impossible. I would lie awake, listening to the floorboards creak, the windows rattle, and the soft whispers that seemed to come from every corner of the cabin. Sometimes I thought I heard a chair scrape across the floor, a door slam shut, or someone breathing right next to me. My flashlight became my lifeline. I never let it go. One night, I decided I had to face it. I grabbed the flashlight and stepped outside, circling the cabin slowly, calling out, "Who's there?" My voice echoed through the trees, but no one answered. The wind picked up suddenly, and the trees swayed violently, but I thought I saw movement in the darkness, a figure standing just beyond the tree line, watching me. I shone the light, and it was gone. By the end of the week, I was exhausted, terrified, and completely alone. I packed my things and prepared to leave, But when I tried to follow the dirt path back to the main road, I found myself back at the cabin. I walked for hours, taking different routes, but every time I ended up back at that same weathered door, the same sagging porch. It was as if the forest had swallowed the world around me and spat me back out at the cabin. That night, I heard the whispers again, more insistent this time, echoing from the walls. Stay. Forever. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but the forest had other plans. I barricaded myself inside the bedroom, lights on, doors locked, fire blazing. And then I saw it, etched into the frost on the windows, words that hadn't been there before. You belong here. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I stayed awake, watching the shadows crawl across the walls, listening to the footsteps pacing just outside my door. And then I realized something horrifying. I hadn't seen my reflection once in the cabin. Not in the windows, not in the stove's metal surface, not even in the small bathroom mirror. It was like I didn't exist in that space, or like the cabin itself had absorbed me into its walls. By the time morning came, the forest was quiet again, deceptively calm. I tried one last time to leave, and this time the path stretched out in front of me, straight and clear. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the paved road leading to civilization. When I did, the dirt path I had been following vanished, replaced by an endless stretch of trees that didn't match the map I had been using. I never returned to that cabin, and I never spoke to anyone about what happened, at least not in detail. The police never found anything when I reported the location, the rental company denied ever owning a cabin in that area, and my photos from the trip showed only empty woods, no cabin, no footprints, no strange carvings, nothing. It was like the entire place had never existed. I moved far away after that, but even years later, I have nightmares of the cabin. I can still feel the weight of the air, the whispering voices, the footsteps circling outside. Sometimes when I drive through forests, I get the sensation of being watched, of a presence moving silently just beyond my vision. I don't know if the cabin was a physical place, a supernatural trap, or a hallucination born from isolation, but I know the fear I felt was real. The truth is, I left a part of myself in those woods. I can't explain it, and I don't want to try. Some places aren't meant to be understood. Some places, once entered, never truly let you leave. I still have dreams where I'm back there, standing on that sagging porch as the wind rattles the windows. I hear the footsteps, I see the shadow, and I know that somewhere in the deep forest, the cabin is waiting. Watching, patient. Story. The end. It was supposed to be a simple weekend getaway. Just me and my friends, Evan, Sarah, and Marcus. We were looking for a break from the city, a chance to unwind in the woods, away from everything that felt suffocating in our lives. Evan had found a small, rustic cabin online, listed as isolated and private, somewhere deep in the Appalachian woods. The photos were charming enough. Log exterior, a stone chimney, a small porch with a swing, but there was something about them that felt almost staged, too perfect. Still, we were all exhausted from work, school, and life in general, so none of us thought much of it. The drive took longer than expected. The GPS worked until a certain point, and then we were on our own, following dirt roads that twisted through dense trees. Every now and then, the road would disappear into mud or rocks, forcing Evan to slow down almost to a crawl. The sun was beginning to set, painting the forest in long shadows when we finally caught sight of the cabin. It looked smaller than in the photos, but charming in a way that made you want to stay inside, keep warm, and shut the world out. We unpacked quickly, tossing our bags onto the creaking wooden floor. The inside was basic, one main room with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and a narrow staircase leading to a loft where 2 beds awaited. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, just the smell of old wood and faint mildew. At first, it felt perfect. This was exactly what we wanted, a break from the chaos. That first night was uneventful, just the 4 of us eating takeout in the dim light of a single lamp. We stayed up late, talking and joking, trying to make the place feel less empty. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of something scratching against the outside walls. At first, I thought it was just a raccoon or some other animal, but then it stopped, and I realized I could hear faint footsteps crunching in the underbrush, circling the cabin. I nudged Evan, but he was fast asleep, snoring loudly. I told Sarah and Marcus, and they laughed it off, saying the wind was probably playing tricks on me. I tried to believe them. The second day, we went for a hike, exploring the trails that led further into the forest. The trees were old and thick, sunlight barely reaching the moss-covered ground. We stumbled upon an old hunting trail, abandoned for years, judging by the collapsed deer stands and rusting signs. It was eerie but fascinating. By the time we returned to the cabin, the sky was gray and clouds hung low, threatening rain. That night, the noises returned, louder and more distinct. Footsteps, thuds, and the unmistakable sound of a door creaking. The cabin had only one real door. The front entrance, which we had all double-checked, was locked. We sat in the living room listening, hearts racing. I thought I saw shadows moving just outside the window, darting between the trees. Probably just a deer, Marcus said, trying to sound casual. But the unease was in all of us. By the third day, things had escalated. Evan had gone to gather firewood in the morning, leaving me, Sarah, and Marcus inside. That's when we noticed it. The front door, which we had locked before breakfast, was now slightly ajar. None of us had touched it. My stomach sank. We searched the cabin thoroughly, every room, the loft, under the beds, but found no sign of anyone. Outside, the ground showed footprints, but they were too large for any of us, and they led straight into the woods, disappearing between the dense trees. The unease turned into fear, a knot in my chest that refused to loosen. We decided to stay together, to be cautious. But that night, the scratching returned, this time from inside the cabin. It started on the floorboards in the main room and moved steadily toward the loft. We huddled together, whispering, listening to the sound of something pacing above us. The beds creaked, as if someone were stepping heavily over the floorboards. Yet, when we dared to peek, no one was there. By the fourth day, our nerves were frayed. We considered leaving, but the roads we had taken in were washed out by rain, and our car was now stuck in thick mud. We were effectively trapped. Panic started to creep in, the kind that made every shadow feel alive. That evening, I went outside to get water from a nearby stream. The forest was silent, too silent. No birds, no insects, nothing except the sound of the rain hitting the leaves. I bent down to fill my bottle and froze. Footprints led right to me. Not ours. Not human. Large, dragging marks, as if something heavy had walked through the mud. I didn't wait to see more. I ran back to the cabin, like my heart hammering in my chest. When I got inside, the others were gone. I called their names, screaming now, but only the echo of my own voice returned. The cabin felt different, oppressive, the air thick and damp. That's when I saw it, a figure in the corner of the living room, hunched, staring at me with eyes that seemed too large, too dark. It didn't move, didn't breathe, but its presence filled the entire room. I ran upstairs, screaming, but the figure was there too, at the top of the loft stairs, blocking the way. My instinct took over. I jumped out of the window onto the muddy ground below, twisting my ankle badly but ignoring the pain. I ran blindly through the trees, the rain soaking me, branches scratching my face. Behind me, I heard laughter. Low, guttural, almost inhuman, echoing between the trunks. Hours later, soaked and exhausted, I stumbled onto a ranger's station along the main road. They called for backup, and when we returned with authorities, the cabin was empty. Evan, Sarah, and Marcus were gone. No signs of struggle, no footprints besides mine. The authorities questioned me, tried to rationalize what I had seen, but I knew what was real. The cabin was a trap, something in the woods that lured people in, something that didn't want them to leave. I haven't returned to the woods since. I haven't even driven past the area. The photos of the cabin online are still there, still inviting, still pristine, like nothing ever happened. Sometimes I see them late at night, glowing on my screen, and I remember the figure in the corner, its eyes following me, patient and silent. I can still hear the laughter, low and guttural, in my dreams. People ask if I think it was human, if it was some kind of criminal or serial killer. I want to believe that, I really do, but deep down I know it wasn't. Human beings don't move like that, don't appear and disappear without a sound. Human beings don't leave footprints that vanish into the woods as if the ground itself swallowed them. I still hear scratching sometimes when the wind blows against my windows. I wake up at night convinced I see a shadow by the corner of my bedroom, just out of reach. It never moves closer, not yet, but it waits. And I know one day, if I let my guard down, it will come back. The thing about the cabin isn't just that it's isolated or that it's easy to get lost in the woods around it. It's that it's patient. It waits for the right people, the ones who are tired, the ones who want to escape their lives, and when it finds them, it doesn't let go. I know I was lucky to get out, lucky to stumble across a road and a ranger's station, but my friends weren't. I think about them every day, wonder what happened to them, if they even exist anymore. Some nights, I dream of them walking through the woods, calling my name, but their eyes aren't their own anymore. They're dark, hollow, like the thing I saw in the cabin. And I know that if I ever go back, even to just look, I'll never leave. I tell people I had a bad weekend in the mountains, that the cabin was too remote, that we got scared and left. They nod, sympathetic, and forget about it. But I know the truth. I can't unknow the truth. That cabin waits for people like me. It waits. Always. And I think about how easy it would be to drive back, just to see, just to make sure. I fight the urge, but some nights the memory is so strong it feels like I'm back there. Hearing the steps above me, the scratching on the floorboards, the breathing in the corners of the room that isn't human. People say the woods are dangerous, that you shouldn't go there alone, but they don't understand. It's not the woods. It's the cabin. It's inside the woods, but it's its own place, a place where the rules of the world don't apply. And I know now that it's alive in a way that defies logic. It doesn't just exist. It watches, it waits, and it takes. Sometimes I dream I hear my friends calling me from the cabin, but I don't move. I can't. I know if I do, it will be the end. The laughter echoes in my mind, low and guttural, the sound of something patient, something eternal. And I know, even from miles away, even in my safe apartment in the city, that it's waiting. I can feel it, waiting. Always Wing Story, the end. The first time I saw the cabin, it looked like it had been swallowed whole by the forest. The pine trees around it were thick and heavy, their trunks darkened with years of rain and moss, and the ground was littered with fallen branches and needles that made walking sound like stepping on broken glass. I had been driving through northern Maine, a route I had taken countless times for work, but this year I decided to get off the main roads and see some of the more remote areas I'd never explored. That's how I stumbled on it, tucked into a small clearing far from the gravel roads I knew. The cabin wasn't much, just a single story with wooden planks that had warped and darkened over decades, a slanted roof with missing shingles, and a small porch that sagged at the center. There was something about it that called to me, though, a kind of quiet loneliness that seemed to match my own life at the time. I was in my mid-30s, recently divorced, and living out of a rental apartment in Portland that felt like a cage. My work as a freelance photographer gave me some flexibility, and I had been chasing stories in Maine for years, but the isolation of my personal life was starting to weigh on me. When I saw the cabin, it didn't scream danger to me. It screamed opportunity. I parked the car at the edge of the clearing, noting that there was no clear path leading up to it from any main road. The surrounding forest was dense, and the overgrown trail leading to the cabin was narrow and thorny. The front door was locked, as I suspected it would be, but the window near the kitchen was ajar. I pushed it open with a little effort, the wood creaking under my weight, and climbed in. Inside, the cabin smelled of damp wood and mold, and dust particles floated in the thin shafts of sunlight that managed to find their way through the grimy windows. There was a fireplace, cold and ashen, and a few remnants of furniture. A rickety table, a couple of chairs, and a bed frame missing its mattress. On the walls, the faded wallpaper peeled like old scabs, revealing the dark wood underneath. The place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. I spent that afternoon exploring the cabin and the small clearing around it. Behind the cabin, the ground dropped sharply, opening into a shallow ravine, and I could hear the distant gurgle of a stream somewhere far below. There was a faint trail that wound around the trees, disappearing into shadows, but it was clear no one had walked there recently. As the day wore on, I realized I had no idea who owned this place or how I had never come across it before. The sense of discovery thrilled me. I made a mental note to come back, maybe spend a weekend here alone to photograph and explore. I returned the following weekend with a backpack, a tent, some food, and my camera equipment. The drive was longer than I had anticipated because the old logging roads had been overtaken by brush and fallen trees. By the time I arrived, the sun was already dipping below the tree line. The cabin looked smaller in the dim light, its silhouette jagged against the fading sky. I unpacked quickly, lighting a small campfire outside, and ate a cold dinner I had packed. The first night was quiet, except for the occasional snap of a branch or rustle of leaves from animals I couldn't see. I slept in my tent because the cabin still smelled of mold, and I wasn't ready to commit to spending a night inside. The next day, I ventured inside. I had brought some cleaning supplies and a small amount of food, thinking I might stay overnight if I could make the place minimally habitable. As I swept the floor, I noticed a small trapdoor in the corner of the living area, partially hidden beneath a threadbare rug. I had almost missed it. The hinges were rusted, and it took some effort to lift. Beneath it was a steep ladder leading into a cramped basement. I shone my flashlight down, revealing stone walls and a dirt floor, but no signs of life. The air smelled heavier down there, like earth and something else I couldn't place. I went back outside and made a mental note to come back with gloves and maybe a mask if I planned to investigate further. The next weekend, I returned prepared. I climbed down the ladder and shone my flashlight across the basement. It was empty at first glance, but as I moved the beam across the walls, I noticed scratches in the stone, small gouges that had been made over time. On closer inspection, there were symbols carved into the stones, rudimentary shapes that I couldn't identify. They weren't modern graffiti, they looked old, weathered. My stomach turned. I took a few photos and decided not to linger. That night, as I sat in my tent outside, I felt a presence. At first, it was just a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, like someone was watching me. Then I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock on the cabin's door. My heart stopped. The cabin was supposed to be empty. I told myself it was a falling branch, or maybe an animal, but the sound was too deliberate, too rhythmic. I stayed still, straining to hear, but the forest around me remained silent. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept returning to the basement and those symbols. I wondered who had lived here before, why they had left, and what the markings meant. Around midnight, the knocking started again, this time louder, more insistent, and coming from the back of the cabin. I grabbed my flashlight and cautiously approached, but when I shined it on the doorway, nothing was there. The forest behind the cabin was dense, and I couldn't see more than a few feet. By morning, I convinced myself it had been paranoia. I packed up, intending to leave and research the cabin from a safe distance. On the drive back, I stopped at the nearest town, a tiny place with a single gas station and a diner. I asked the cashier if she knew anything about an old cabin in the woods off the logging roads. She froze, her face tightening. "There's been a cabin out there for as long as I can remember," she said. "Nobody goes near it. People disappear sometimes. Not that anyone talks about it much. The last folks who stayed there, well, they never came back." Her words hit me harder than I expected. I laughed nervously, but something in her tone was enough to make me feel that my instincts had been right. I left, feeling unsettled, but I couldn't stop thinking about the cabin. Something about it called to me. I went back a month later, despite every warning I had received. This time, I decided I would spend the night inside. I brought food, a sleeping bag, and my camera gear. The cabin was just as I remembered, silent, abandoned, and yet alive in a way that made my skin crawl. The trapdoor to the basement beckoned. I didn't go down immediately, setting up my sleeping bag near the fireplace and trying to shake the unease. As night fell, the sounds started again. Soft scratching on the walls, low whispers that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. I convinced myself it was the wind, or maybe the house settling. But then the scratching turned into tapping, slow and deliberate, like someone walking inside the walls. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it into the corners. Nothing. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the porch, heavy, deliberate, pacing. I froze, telling myself it was an animal. Then the front door rattled, like someone was trying to push it open. I grabbed my camera and shone the flashlight at the door. Nothing. The forest outside was dark and still. My stomach churned, and for the first time, fear overcame curiosity. I wanted to leave, but I had no car. I had parked down the trail, and it was too dark to navigate safely. I spent the night awake, huddled in the corner of the cabin, listening to the scratches, tapping, and whispers. At times, I thought I saw shadows move in the corners of my vision. When I dared to approach the trapdoor, the whispers grew louder, almost as if someone were warning me not to go down. My rational mind screamed at me to leave, but my morbid curiosity forced me to open it. The basement smelled worse than ever, earthy and metallic. My flashlight caught the symbols on the wall, more numerous now, some freshly carved. I stumbled backward, heart racing. Then I noticed something else. Footprints in the dirt floor, small and shallow, leading away from the ladder and disappearing into the shadows. They weren't mine. I backed out of the basement, tripping over the ladder, and ran to the door. The porch was empty, the forest silent. But as I turned back to the cabin, I saw them. Faint outlines, human-shaped, moving just beyond the trees. They didn't run. They didn't approach. They just watched. I left immediately, sprinting down the trail in the dark. Branches tore at my clothes and scratched my arms, but I didn't care. When I finally reached my car, I jumped in, locked the doors, and drove without looking back. I never returned to the cabin, but the experience haunted me. I researched land records, old newspapers, and missing person reports. There was nothing concrete, just rumors of people disappearing in those woods, their last known location often near the same stretch of abandoned logging roads. Some of the older residents whispered about a cabin that called to the lonely, the curious, the foolish, and that some never left. Years later, I still dream about that basement, the symbols, the shadows at the edge of the trees. I've convinced myself that I imagined parts of it, that fear distorted reality. But every now and then, when I'm alone in the woods or driving down a deserted road, I swear I hear scratching behind walls, soft tapping at doors, whispers that seem to come from nowhere. And I know that somewhere out there, that cabin is waiting, patient and hungry, for the next person foolish enough to find it. Story the end. It was the kind of place that seemed untouched by time, a small cabin tucked deep in the northern forests of Maine. The GPS on my phone had long since lost signal, and the dense canopy of pine and spruce blocked out most of the weak October sunlight. I had taken the week off work to get away from the city, away from the constant buzz of people, traffic, and notifications. A quiet cabin, a couple of days of solitude. What could possibly go wrong? The drive up had been longer than expected. The map led me down a series of narrow dirt roads that twisted unpredictably between dense trees, some of the branches low enough to scrape the roof of my old Subaru. Around mile 3, I realized I hadn't passed another car in nearly an hour, and the silence outside the vehicle felt unnerving in a way I hadn't anticipated. I tried to focus on the idea of peace and isolation, repeating it in my head like a mantra, but an inexplicable tension had begun to creep in. The cabin itself was modest, weathered wooden siding, a small stone chimney, and a porch that sagged in the middle. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, suggesting the previous occupant or caretaker had left recently. A hand-painted sign read, "Welcome," hanging crookedly beside the door. I opened it with a soft creak, stepping inside, and was immediately hit by the smell of aged wood, damp earth, and something faintly acrid I couldn't identify. Inside, the cabin was bare but functional. A small kitchenette, a table, a couple of chairs, a loft bedroom, and a wood stove. Dust motes floated in the air, disturbed only by my entrance. It looked like no one had stayed here in months, maybe years. I set down my bag, lit a fire, and tried to shake off the uneasy feeling that had settled in my chest during the drive. The first night was quiet, almost painfully so. The wind rustled the treetops, snapping occasional branches that sounded startlingly close. I had brought a lantern, which cast long, wavering shadows along the walls, giving the small cabin a larger, more oppressive feeling than it deserved. Around midnight, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside, heavy, deliberate, and slow. I froze, straining to hear, but after a few moments they stopped. I told myself it was an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but my stomach tightened. I couldn't shake the idea that something was watching me. The next day, I explored the surrounding woods. The trail was overgrown as though no one had walked it in years, and I kept a mental note of the direction so I could find my way back. The trees were tall and ancient, their twisted roots rising from the forest floor like gnarled hands. As I moved deeper into the woods, I noticed things that made me pause. A set of footprints in the soft dirt, too large to be mine, heading toward the cabin, but none leading away. My mind tried to rationalize maybe they were from an animal, a hunter, or some lost traveler, but there was something unnatural about them, the spacing too deliberate, too calculated. I returned to the cabin, uneasy but trying to dismiss my fears. That evening, the footsteps came again, this time closer to the cabin, circling it in the darkness. I couldn't see anyone through the windows, yet I could hear the crunch of dirt and leaves, the scraping of shoes against old wooden boards. My phone had no service. The flashlight app barely worked through the heavy glass. I felt trapped. A small, insignificant figure in a forest that seemed to be closing in around me. By the third day, I began to notice other things. Small changes inside the cabin. The wood stove had been moved slightly. A chair was no longer where I had left it, and faint scratches appeared along the walls near the door. I could swear I hadn't touched them. I told myself I was imagining things, sleep-deprived and stressed. But every night, the footsteps grew louder, more purposeful, circling the cabin with a rhythm that set my nerves on edge. One night, I decided to confront it. I grabbed a hatchet from the kitchen and stepped outside into the blackness, the cold biting through my jacket. The wind had died, and the forest was eerily still. I called out, "Hello, who's there?" My voice sounded small, swallowed by the trees. I waited. Nothing. Then a movement. A shadow, a figure just beyond the tree line, watching. I froze, heart hammering. When I blinked, it was gone. Sleep became impossible. Each creak of the cabin, each whisper of wind, sounded like someone or something moving closer. I started leaving lights on, circling the cabin with a lantern, checking doors and windows repeatedly. On the fourth night, I awoke to something different. The footsteps were inside, slow, deliberate, pacing the main room. My heart skipped a beat. I grabbed the hatchet, standing in the loft bedroom doorway, and called out, voice shaking. Silence. Then a thud from below, heavy, unmistakable. I don't remember how long I stood there, frozen, listening. The sound repeated, moving closer, deliberate and heavy, until it was directly beneath me. My breath caught in my throat. Then a whisper. So quiet I almost didn't hear it. "You shouldn't be here." Panic surged. I ran, tripping down the loft ladder, hatchet raised. The cabin felt alive, each shadow stretching toward me. I swung the hatchet blindly at a dark corner. Silence again. No figure. Nothing. My mind raced, trying to convince me it was sleep paralysis, a trick of exhaustion. I tried to sleep again, but couldn't, too afraid to close my eyes. The next morning, I resolved to leave. I packed quickly, ignoring the nagging sensation that someone or something was following me. As I opened the cabin door, the forest seemed to shift. The path I had come up on was gone, replaced by dense undergrowth. I tried to force my way through, breaking branches, but the forest twisted unnaturally, looping back on itself. Every direction I turned, the cabin remained in sight, though I had thought I was far from it. Hours passed. I stumbled, fell, and cursed myself for coming here alone. As night fell, the air grew colder, heavier, and I could hear it. The footsteps now all around me, echoing off unseen trees, circling, closing in. I ran blindly, heart pounding, tripping over roots and stones, until I was back at the cabin porch, gasping for breath. The door was closed, though I had left it open, and a faint glow flickered from inside like a fire burning in the darkness. I spent that night in terror, crouched behind the cabin, trying to convince myself the dawn would bring clarity, a path out. But morning revealed nothing. The path I had taken was obliterated, the forest dense and unwelcoming. I tried calling for help on the emergency radio I had brought. No signal. The wind carried whispers through the trees, low and urgent, like the forest itself was alive. Days bled into one another. I survived on a can of beans and a small water bottle, rationing carefully. The cabin seemed to change subtly every day. The furniture shifted slightly, the walls marked with scratches, and sometimes in the corner of my eye I saw fleeting shadows move with intent. I began to feel watched, not by animals, but by something intelligent, patient, and ancient. I remember the night I found the basement door. I hadn't noticed it before, hidden beneath a rug in the corner. The handle was cold, almost impossibly so, and as I lifted it, a rancid smell rose from the darkness below. Something moved, a whisper echoed from the stairs. "You belong here now." My instincts screamed at me to run, but something compelled me forward. The basement was a small, dirt-floored room. The walls were lined with strange symbols, scratched deep into the wood, some blackened, some appearing fresh. In the center, a shallow pit held what looked like bones, small and brittle, almost like animal bones, but I couldn't be sure. I didn't stay long. I slammed the door and ran upstairs, the whisper following me, mocking me. That night, the footsteps were everywhere, inside and outside the cabin, circling, pacing, whispering. Sleep was impossible. I realized then that the cabin wasn't abandoned. It was alive, and it didn't want me to leave. On the seventh day, I made my move. I packed a small bag, leaving most of my things behind, and tried to retrace the path I had come. The forest twisted unnaturally, the same impossibility as before. Every step seemed to bring me back to the cabin porch. I screamed, pleading, crying, begging whatever was in those trees to let me go. The wind responded with a low, guttural laughter, and the shadows lengthened toward me. I ran into the night, collapsing several times, getting scratched and cut by branches, but always waking to find myself at the cabin porch again. Exhaustion and despair set in. My rational mind, the part of me that knew this was impossible, began to fade, replaced by the primal fear of something beyond comprehension. I felt its presence in every corner of the woods, a slow, deliberate hunger for fear. I stayed hidden one night behind the cabin, too terrified to move, listening. The footsteps stopped, silence fell, and then a soft, deliberate knock on the door. 1, 2, 3 knocks. I held my breath, waited. Then a whisper, unmistakable, "Come in." I didn't. I ran again at dawn, though dawn felt no different than night in that forest. I don't know how many days I wandered, losing track of time entirely. Hunger, thirst, and fear became a constant background hum, and I began to understand something horrifying. The cabin, the forest, whatever lived here, it didn't care about my survival. It wanted me to understand that I was no longer in control. Eventually, I stopped trying to escape. I found a small clearing a mile from the cabin, or what I thought was a mile, and collapsed. I slept for hours, only to wake to the sound of footsteps approaching. They weren't the hurried, erratic steps of an animal or a panicked person. They were slow, deliberate, confident. And then I saw it. A figure standing just beyond the tree line, tall, shadowed, human-like, but not human, watching me. It didn't move, didn't blink, just observed. I could feel it in my chest, pressing down, filling me with a cold, inescapable dread. I've been here ever since, hiding, moving, always circling back to the cabin. It's impossible to leave, and the footsteps never stop. They pace around me, inside and out, whispering, reminding me that the forest owns me now. I have no signal, no way to call for help, no one who will believe me. The cabin waits, patient, ever present, and the forest stretches endlessly, twisting reality, trapping me in a nightmare I cannot wake from. Some nights, when the wind dies down and the shadows lengthen, I hear laughter, low, guttural, knowing. I know it's coming from the trees, from the cabin, from the very air around me, and I know that no matter what I do, no matter how fast I run or how far I hide, the forest will always bring me back. I am trapped, alone, watched, and the cabin waits. The last time I tried to leave, I thought I saw a car in the distance, headlights flickering. I ran toward it, screaming, hoping, praying. When I got closer, it wasn't a car at all, just a shadow moving with the shape of a vehicle, twisting, shifting, impossible. I fell to my knees, realizing then that the forest doesn't just trap your body. It traps your mind, your hope, your very sense of reality. And so I wait. I wait behind the trees. I wait in the shadows. I wait for the footsteps that never end. The cabin is still there, just beyond the tree line, patient, alive, waiting. And I know that one day it will come for me fully, and then the forest will have me completely. Until then, I hide, I watch, and I listen. The wind carries whispers now through the trees, through the night. They speak my name. And I know the forest is listening always, and so is the cabin. Story the end.